All right, thanks everybody for coming. Am I okay without a mic? Is everybody hearing me fine? Okay, cool. I've got kids, so I'm good at projecting and yelling to get from second floor to first floor. Thank you, Hope, for the invite. Thank you to the museum for hosting us. First of all, the disclaimer is that neither Paul or I know anything about fire or ice. We both study various aspects of stream ecology, but that's kind of, we're going to talk more about how climate change is affecting the stream network within a watershed context. But before we get to the local aspects, what I'd like to do is start with just a quick couple of slides about what's happening globally. And some of you have probably seen a lot of stuff like this, and if you have, just a little quick review. This particular data set comes from ice core data that were drilled in Antarctica. And what's nice about the Antarctica continental ice sheet is that as the glacier is built from the top down, those successive snowfalls become compacted, but as they become compacted, they trap bubbles of atmosphere in them. And so if you can go to a really deep core, which would also then be a really old core, you can then really carefully core it out, extract it, and then release those gases in a controlled environment and then measure what the atmosphere used to be like on Earth. So this is the oldest core that we've got, and you can look over here on the bottom axis, that says 800,000 years before present, up until the modern day. And when we look at these ancient gases, we can reveal that the Earth's climate has, quote unquote, naturally bounced back and forth between different states. So what we'll see here is in the, over there on that axis, hard to read, 280 parts per million CO2. So these are areas when the atmosphere has more CO2, and through other proxy measurements, we see that the surface temperature is a little bit warmer. Okay, and then we also see times that we call ice ages when there's less CO2, and then the atmosphere is correspondingly cooler. And then we see the same trends in red, which is methane. Okay, so this gives us a pretty good estimation of what's been happening with atmospheric dynamics through time, through geological time. But when you look at what we're doing today, Earth's atmospheric composition is really quite different. And there's really no question that it's human beings that are doing this. You'll see that today we're at around 406 parts per million CO2, and we're at about 1,800 parts per billion methane. Both of those are pretty powerful greenhouse gases. And you can see that we're essentially off the charts. Okay, and one of the things that I'll have you note is that the difference between today's atmosphere at 406 parts per million, it's over 100 parts per million higher than the pre-industrial atmosphere that existed just 200 years ago and was the atmosphere that's pretty typical of an interglacial period on Earth. The interglacial periods on Earth are also about 100 ppm higher than the glacial periods where Seattle was covered with 1 mile of continental ice. Okay, so we have really, really dramatically changed the atmosphere in a really short amount of time. And so, of course, the big question is, what does that mean? Well, you've maybe seen this. The new data are out for 2017. Depending on exactly which data set, 2015, 16, 17 were the warmest years in the instrumental record. This record goes back to about 1880. It's based on land-based thermometers with extrapolations made out to ocean areas, et cetera. So we see that the average surface temperature is rapidly increasing. Currently, we are sitting at about 1 degree Celsius warmer than we were essentially mid-20th century average. Okay, so it's on. Okay, it's warming right now. So what is happening from that? Well, here's some global data showing the Arctic sea ice. Now, these data are constrained by satellite measurements, which only began in 1979. But you can see that sea ice is down 40%, okay, on average over that 40-year period. I keep wanting to go back here I'm not used to these guys. Okay, what's happening to land ice? That's a really important one because land ice is storing water out of the oceans and onto land. East Antarctica is shown in green. Okay, and you'll see what we see in a lot of climate data is that it doesn't always behave the same everywhere. Okay, but that doesn't mean that it's not warming. Okay, so the East Antarctic ice sheet is possibly even growing a little bit, although you can see from the shaded area that that's a pretty wide range of error, or the estimation error. You can also see that the Antarctic Peninsula in general is declining, and most of that is coming from West Antarctica. Okay, so the Arctic ice sheet is definitely thinning, and the Greenland ice sheet, shown in blue, is also thinning, and the combination of the Antarctic and Greenland ice sheet is shown in black. So we're definitely seeing a lot of ice mass. Take a look at the time scale on that. That's only 20 years, and we've seen a loss of 4,000 gigatons of ice. Now, there's a lot of gigatons of ice, to be sure, okay? But the trends are unmistakable. What's that happening? What's happening to the ocean? Okay, well, that's land-based ice. That land-based ice is water that used to be in the ocean that's now stored on land. So, of course, what happens when you melt it and it runs back into the ocean is the sea level goes up. And so we're seeing here, over, again, a similar time frame, about the past 25-ish years, we're seeing a pretty solid increase in sea level at a rate of about 3 millimeters per year. Not much, right? But multiply it by 10 years, that's 30 millimeters, that's 3 centimeters. Multiply by 100 years, that's, what is that? That's 300 millimeters. That's a foot, okay? So it's not insignificant. So these are the things that we all hear about on the news, and they're the things that make climate change, I would argue, kind of hard to understand, wrap your head around, not conceptually, but about the solutions. What do we do? What does it mean for us in our own hometown? And so what Paul and I are going to focus on is thinking about what's happening here in the Yakima Basin and in the Pacific Northwest as a whole. So you'll see these letters, B1 and A1B, on a couple of different slides. I just want to take a little bit to explain these. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has different scenarios of the future. And there's scenarios that range anywhere from, like, we stop burning fossil fuels tomorrow, we rapidly become sustainable, we make a global effort, coordinated effort to try to combat climate change, to, on the opposite extreme, business as usual, we don't do anything, we just let it roll and see what happens. Both of these are somewhat in the middle. Scenario A1B is pretty close to where we are now. That's the track we're pretty much on. And what that means is rapid economic growth, but with balanced energy sources. And that means that as renewables become cheaper, we use them more. That's going to decrease CO2 going to the atmosphere. That's in contrast to the B1 scenario, which would correspond to increased environmental considerations, greater effort toward international sustainable development, etc. And then what they do is they input all these different data into these massive supercomputers. They run these models over and over again. They're all what are called probabilistic models, so they don't all generate the same answers. And then what they see is a mean of the model, and that mean is shown in this solid line. So the solid red line corresponds to the A1B scenario, which is pretty much the track we're on now. And then the range there that bleeds into orange as it mixes with the yellow scenario, that's the estimation of the model, okay? So what it means, basically, is that the Pacific Northwest is looking at being roughly 2 to 3 degrees Celsius warmer. For those of you who speak Fahrenheit, that's about 4 to 6-ish degrees Fahrenheit, a little less. And we might even see a little increase in precipitation, upwards of about 5%. But take a look at the range of output on these models. It could be up, it could be down. We're really not quite sure, but the average trend line is a little bit more precipitation. And this is looking at 100 years, okay? So most of us won't be here, but you know, our kids, our grandkids are gonna be here. So what's that gonna look like in the Northwest? Well, here's the Yakima Basin. I can't explain to you why this Yakima Basin has a nice straight line right there. That's not normal in watersheds, right? That's just an artifact of the GIS that was done. But what does it mean? Because it's going to mean different things in different parts of our basin, right? I'm going to focus on what's happening up here in the mountains where the forests are. And Dr. James is going to focus on what happens once that water that's stored in snowpack runs into rivers and makes its way down the valley. Okay, so we're going to kind of divide it between a little bit high and low in the watershed. In general, it means less snow and more rain. Sound familiar? Well, kind of sounds a little bit like this winter, but what do I know? But also, that means it's going to be a longer growing season, right? Spring is going to happen sooner. Plants are going to break their dormancy sooner. They're going to wait longer to go into dormancy in the winter, which means really a greater demand for water because the plant's going to be growing longer. And at the same time, that's going to come with hotter and drier summers. So not only is the water demand going to be higher because the plants are growing longer, it's going to be higher because there's going to be more evaporation because it's going to be warmer. Okay? Oops, I just did the wrong thing. Okay. So each of these changes is going to affect the watershed at differently in different places. So up in the forest, we have to consider how forests are going to respond to less snow, more rain, longer growing season, and hotter, drier summers. But in order to really understand that, we have to kind of rewind the clock about 100 years and look at how our forests have changed over that time period. I understand there's some folks from the Forest Service here, so no offense, but we're going to talk a little bit about the legacy of forest management, or some might say mismanagement. This is a shot from the Colorado Rockies taken in the early 1900s. You can see widely spaced trees here, pretty open park-like subalpine environment. That's what it looks like recently. It's quite a big change, right? And then if you take a look at Ebbets Pass in the Sierra Nevada of California, not even quite 100 years ago, you can see there's some open places out here. Now you can see that with fire suppression, the trees are a lot thicker. Okay, and we know this is a problem. Hopefully you have noticed the smoke in the valleys the last couple of years as we've had a lot of increased wildfires throughout Washington State, really throughout the West. It's our turn, it's inevitable. Fire is a natural part of our ecosystem, and for a lot of well-intentioned but perhaps not very far-sighted policies, we've put out fires that started because we were trying to protect timber resources and trying to protect land resources without necessarily considering what the long-term consequences of that would be on the forest. Okay, what it does mean is that a lot of Douglas fir and grand fir have grown up in between those open spaces. Those are tree species that, depending on the elevation you were at, would get burned out by these periodic fires. Okay, and the bigger trees with a thicker bark would be left behind. So the fires used to be short and fast, and not what we would call standreplacing, where the entire forest goes down. Now, as a consequence, what's happened is now we've got a more solid network of trees in the forest. So any fire that starts can really easily get up into the crown, spread, and you get these big stand-replacing fires, okay? But there's another element in the landscape, and that's the insect that I've been studying with collaborators for the last few years, the western spruce budworm. Okay, the western spruce budworm is a native part of our ecosystem, so some people would consider them to be a forest pest, but if they are, they're maybe like they're your family that comes over for the holidays. They're kind of a pest, but they kind of belong there too, right? They're a native part of the ecosystem, and if they were said to have a role in the ecosystem, a job, it's that they thin these trees when they get thicker, okay? Because they love to eat Douglas fir, and they love to eat grand fir. Their range, you can see, is throughout North America, especially here in the Pacific Northwest, some isolated populations in the desert Southwest where they have similar forests. Excuse me. And they tend to be an outbreak lepidopterans, or the little moth. And they tend to have kind of a cyclic pattern of big population booms and busts and booms and busts. They seem to be related to drought cycles, although it's maybe a little bit different in the desert Southwest compared to the Northwest, but they kind of come and go. In the recent decade, they've been on an uptick in the Northwest, so that they're currently trending back down again. That's them right there. That's the first Instar Larvae. So that means that's right after it hatches from an egg in August. That thing crawls, and it crawls into the trunk of the tree, and it overwinters. And then the next spring, it comes out and it starts eating the new needle growth. They're budworms, eat the buds, the newly burst buds of these, what we call short needle firs, right? The Doug firs and the grand firs especially. And by the end of the summer, there's our late summer larva. Excuse me, I'm getting off my cycle here. Here's our short needle conifers that they eat, and you can see some of the feeding right here. This is early in the season. You can see the brighter color green of those short needle firs. And they eat a lot, so of course they poop a lot, okay? And the fancy word that we use for insect poop is frass. So in a week period, you can see that if you put out an Nalgene bottle underneath the right tree, you're gonna get a lot of insect frass in there, especially compared to the litter that's falling. Eventually they'll pupate, okay? After they're done eating, they reach their final instar larva, they pupate. That's its pupal case right there. If you're out there in, depending on the elevation, mid to late July, and you underside of these furs, you can see those pupa or even the open pupal cases, and they, rinse and repeat, lay more eggs and start the cycle again. This is an area near Blue Creek that I've been studying. You can see what we call top kill and stand level defoliation. Okay, so you can see how thick the trees are there too, right? This is a result of fire suppression, a lot of small trees. They're small, they're drought stressed because it's summer, they're drought stressed because there's a lot of demand for water. They're weak and they're really susceptible, and this is like being at an all-you-can-eat. This is like going to the Royal Fork if you're a western spruce bloodworm. And in doing so, they can ultimately kill those trees. So the current outbreak has been relatively sustained. Note these are slightly old data. I did not have a chance to update these, and I apologize for that. But there's Kittitas County, and you can see that the recent decades that we've had a lot of defoliation in Kittitas County. Now it's subtle. You'll see it when you go over Blewett in the summer, for example. You go over Blewett in July and August, and all the trees look orange, right? Looks like they're going to die. That's all budworm damage, most of it. There's other things, but a lot of that's budworm damage. They've eaten that outer surface of leaves, and the dying, okay? If you take a look at the level of defoliation, 800,000 acres defoliated in a single year, that's on par with fire damage. We've had some record-breaking fire seasons in the Pacific Northwest the last several years, but this is a more subtle disturbance, and it's not quite as dramatic as fires, but it's equally impacting, at least in terms of its spatial scale, okay? It's all over the state, and it's a big impact. So I've been wondering what this is to streams, okay? So I've got a little cartoon here of a stream and the trees surrounding it, and what we know about budworms is that they thin the canopy. Done any hiking up in I'm talking small headwater streams that are this wide, maybe up to your ankle, pretty high headwaters. Everybody's been up in those knows they're really shady, okay? Well, if they're thinning the canopy, as shown here, whoa, there we go, as shown there, they're going to increase the level of light that we get in streams. They could actually change activity, okay? Conversely, they're also inputting a lot of frass into the streams. And that frass is a carbon source that could be broken down by microbes, okay? But frass is just chewed up litter. So is it really any different than if the needles fall into the stream on their own? Okay, and this was the big question that I asked 2 summers ago, and I'd like to share with you guys the experimental results that I got. But it's a little bit hard to see in this angle. Let's take it through a microscope. That's a Doug fir needle. That's a Doug fir needle. I collected these from the bottom of a stream. Everything else in that sample is spruce budworm frass. Okay, so it's not an insignificant contribution to the stream in terms of its energy budget. Okay, so the big questions I wanted to ask were, how does that frass input affect algal photosynthesis? That's the base of the food web, right? That's plants, that's carbon fixed by sunlight. How does that affect the food web relative to what we'd call community respiration, which is the breakdown of that organic matter by things like fungi and microbes in the streams? Because both of those are really important carbon sources that feed bacteria, that feed insects, that feed little fish, that feed big fish, that Dr. James is going to be talking about. Okay. I also wanted to know, is there an effect where we're adding carbon to the stream, and things in stream eat carbon, but we're also adding light, right? So will there be a contrasting effect there? Which effect is going to be bigger? And so what we call all that in the stream lingo is what's called biofilm metabolism. Has anybody been in a river and slipped on a rock? That's biofilm, okay? So it's algae, it's bacteria, it's all the stuff that sits on the surface of that rock, and it cycles through energy and nutrients, and it essentially feeds the base of the food web. So we want to know what's going to happen to the base of the food web, because that's got consequences for what else can live in these streams. So I did an experiment, and I mixed all these different things together, and I artificially shaded the stream. You can see there's some little things in the stream bed there, and there's other guys there. Oh, those are rocks. Sorry, I can't quite see from this angle. Those are what we call little chambers, right? So we've taken rocks, isolated them from the stream. It's done our little experimental injections, and then we measure stuff, okay? And I was happy to see that when you reduce light in a stream, you also reduce the amount of light getting to the stream. Okay, it's one of those results that when you're a scientist, you're like, whew, okay, right? The experiment might have worked, okay? If we saw the opposite thing, we'd be really nervous, okay? So let's look at what actually happened here to the rate of photosynthesis, and that's what that stands for, gross primary production. Just think of it as photosynthesis, okay? What we see is that in ambient light conditions where I did not reduce light levels, there was a lot more photosynthesis compared to in the reduced light levels. Again, this is the result we hope to see and we're happy to see. That's just the statistical significance. That's a really low number. That means we're good. That means it was a really different thing that we saw, okay? What was interesting though is that when we added frass or litter, we didn't see a change in photosynthesis rates, which is interesting because frass and litter also have nutrients with them. And you guys will see what happens when you put nutrients on your lawn, right? And then you spend the next couple of months mowing it. I mean, plants and algae both need nutrients and sunlight. So here we've given them light and nutrients, but the frass and the litter nutrient additions didn't really seem to do much of anything. And if we express photosynthesis on a slightly different basis, if we look at it in terms of per unit of chlorophyll A, like that's the magic doing the photosynthesis, right? If we look at it on that basis, what we see is that the ambient light conditions and the control condition where I didn't add anything was higher than when I added frass and litter at the same time. And this is really interesting because I told you that they're also adding nutrients, right? So it's not just that the photosynthesis isn't changing, it's that photosynthesis is actually lower when you add nutrients and frass and litter, even if there's light there. And that's kind of an interesting result. And what we think is happening is that there are compounds in those conifers that are actually suppressing the level of photosynthesis. Okay, it's something, we call it allelopathy in biology, but it means that it's basically like it's an attack molecule that prevents other stuff from working really well. Okay, very interesting result for us. The next thing to look at though is what happened to the breakdown of organic matter by microbes, by fungi. And we're gonna measure that as respiration rate. Same respiration as you and I. Inhale oxygen, breathe out CO2. What we saw is that light was not significant. Here's our control, there's our frass, there's our litter. And the little letters all indicate that they're different from each other. And the highest value here shows us that when you add frass to the stream, it actually really stimulates respiration. It burns through that carbon faster, okay? When you express it instead on a per molecule, a per unit weight of organic matter, just a slightly different way to look at it, we see the same effect. Frass really is consistent with a good carbon source in these streams. Not only that, but it's actually better than litter. Remember, I wanted to know if are litter and frass just the same thing? Just one of them comes out of a bug's butt and the other one just comes from a tree? Well, they're different. The frass is actually better, probably because it's been conditioned, right? It's like manure, it's like fertilizer, right? It's been conditioned, and so the insects, or the microbes in the stream bottom are going to be able to eat that faster. So, what does any of this mean for streams? Well, we think that when you have a bloodworm outbreak, you're going to see an increase in light and frass at the same time, okay? What it looks like will happen is that frass inputs to the stream may well suppress photosynthesis despite the addition of light, okay? But also it could stimulate the breakdown of organic carbon. So what it kind of implies to the food web of streams is that during an outbreak, even though there's more light, there's more of this like really yummy labile carbon, really, easy to eat carbon going into the system, and it could stimulate it. Don't forget it's also going to be warmer, right? And biological systems move faster when it's warmer. So this could be a double effect. However, once, like now, we're at a kind of the outbreak has subsided a little bit. Now we don't have that influence of frass anymore. Now we just have light reaching the streams. So then we might actually see in the end an increase in productivity by algae in those streams. So what we might actually see is that it's not a simple, yes, this is what streams are going to do. It's very conditioned on how close you are to the outbreak occurring versus how far away you are versus how much those forests have recovered after the outbreak to shade the stream again. Let's come back to this and think about what's going to happen. We do know, most people that study climate change are pretty certain that the interaction between climate change and a legacy of fire suppression is going to amplify spruce bloodworm outbreaks. It's pretty well accepted that insect outbreaks are going to be going up in the next couple of decades as a result of climate change. So we also see that with an increase in precipitation, and not just precipitation, but rain, we're going to become more of a rain-dominant flow regime. Okay, that means that when it rains, the river's going to go up, as opposed to historically what's happened is it snows, it snows, it snows, it snows, and then it rains, and the river really goes up, right? That's a whole different flow regime. And so what that might mean is that, this is taken from the Quinault River, this is from an EPA model. It shows the early 1900s in black, and it shows here, this is a little bit of a different system than ours, this is more of a coastal system, but it still shows the influence of a rain-dominant regime. So here's winter rain, starting in October down here, winter rain, freezing snowpack, snow melt, and then our summer drought when temperatures and the weather is awesome in the Northwest, okay? By the 2040s, we could be looking at a whole lot of rain, not much snow melt, and a big drop down to what we would call a base flow condition, where the stream is really low and it's only being fed by groundwater. This is a similar look of a hydrograph. This is from the American River. We're starting in January instead. Different trend because we're more of a snowmelt driven regime in this system, at least historically. So we see, here's winter, right? Winter starting, a little bit of rain, freezing conditions, a lot of snow accumulation. Once those temperatures pop over freezing, big snow melt, big drop down to what we call base flow, stable conditions before everything starts again. Well, where are budworms in all of this? That's my big question. Budworms break out in about May, and they're small at first. You saw how small they were, and they get bigger. So as the streams are going down, they're getting bigger, and they're eating more and more. And what's happening as streams go down is they get more retentive. They don't move as much stuff downstream. Stuff that falls in stays. Okay? So we're going to have a longer period where those budworms are able to influence a stream that's close to base flow, and there's less export downstream. So it looks like what we might wind up with is a sometimes more productive food web in these high elevation streams, as long as they're wet still, right? If we get enough snow melt and enough rainfall, they're not going to be streams. As long as they're still wet, we get a lot of retention, a lot of saving of organic matter, and we might even see then that productivity in these systems actually increases. We don't really know yet. We'll see. Big question is what happens downstream, and that's what Paul James is going to tell us about.
All right, guys, so I'm going to tell a story that I bet most of you already know. So this is not original research. This is just taking the climate data that Clay said that we didn't gather and ask the question, what happens if we go from those tiny little streams that Clay talked about to, bigger systems, the streams that you guys usually play around, and then all the way down to the main river. So back to our home here, right? We live in a basin that's highly regulated. We control the water, except, of course, okay, the Tianaway we don't control. We don't control some of the upper Naches. But other than that, we control this basin. I say we, well, okay, the Bureau of Reclamation controls the flow. And I pulled this off their website 2 days ago. So this shows where we store water. This little teacup diagram, and some of you may have seen this before, but this is where we store water in the upper reservoirs and Rimrock and this one. Don't worry about the red numbers, but essentially this means by, May, these will all be full, and then we will start to drain them to get all the water down here for all the uses, right? Fish, agriculture, everything. But what you don't see on here is another reservoir, a much more, very important reservoir that you can't see on this map. And that's this reservoir of all this frozen water. And that's that's Ketchless, Gold Creek Valley. Extremely important. So we've always had this snow, And then as these reservoirs here start to drain, this starts to melt in June, July, keeps them full, and that's how we've been living for several years, right? Well, I'd like to know what's going to happen when we see a shift, what Clay mentioned, where we see a whole lot less of this, but a lot more rain. Not that it's going to rain in, let's say, February 1st for a while, except today. What's going to happen then when we have that? Well, that water's not going to sit up here like this all summer. It's going to flow, which means in the summer it's all going to be gone. We'll have low flows and probably warmer, shallower streams. And what's that going to do? I think we got a glimpse of that. Some of you will remember. I know some of you in this room, because I know you'll remember this. What happened in 2015? Well, here's an image from 2014. This is the upper Yakima Basin. There's our snowpack. 1 year later, this was 2015. You can see the reservoirs there in May, hardly any snow up there. And some of you in this room, I actually worked pretty hard to try to save fish that were literally drying up in little pools. It was a pretty big deal, and we even felt the effects of that this year, because all of that caused a lot of salmon to die, and salmon runs this year were extremely low harvest, tons of fisheries closed because of that. So is that what we're going to see every year? Was that weird, or is that just like the new normal we have to live with? So I want to focus on, just briefly, a couple of species that are found here in the upper basin: Westslope cutthroat trout and bull trout. These things are really sensitive to ice-cold, clean water. These are much more widespread than bull trout. Bull trout in the basin here, we monitor them by measuring or counting their nest where they spawn. So this graph just shows different parts of the basin. This sort of reddish line is from the Natchez Arm. This is from the upper Yakima. These are pretty low numbers. So these populations, at least in the upper Yakima, are really, really at a low level. And so one of the questions is, what's going to happen when the climate shifts with stuff like this? Well, I borrowed some information, stole, whatever, from this group. Rocky Mountain Research Lab with the Forest Service has done some really interesting work, this whole group, and they call themselves the Cold Water Climate Shield, and they have focused on cutthroat and bull trout to do a lot of modeling. And I pulled this slide off their website, and when I pulled it off a couple of years ago, 2014 was a new record. And I went, oh, shoot. Well, last year was yet a new record. So is this going to be a new record every year for the next 50 years? Maybe so. So what do these people do? Well, they take the global data, they zoom it down to the Northwest region, they focused on the Rocky Mountains here, took a lot of on-the-ground data from temperature, flows, and everything, and then they focus it within basins, and that's what they've done. So just real quick example with bull trout. They took data and showed where do you find bull trout in the Rockies, and they actually looked at some of the southern Cascades in the 1980s. So blue definitely has bull trout, yellow, there's a chance, but that's where the good ice-cold, clean water habitats are. Put in the climate models with the A1B and the B1 that Clay talked about, and oops, that's all that's left for, but this is with no other problems going on. This is purely based on temperature, that's what's going to happen. Same thing with cutthroat. They're much more widespread, but they are severely reduced. This was all based on the Rockies. They now have expanded into the central and northern Cascades. So this year, I think, that data should be available. Unfortunately, I'm pretty sure that I know, and a lot of you know what this is going to show, that the bull trout in this basin, just with temperature alone, are going to be pretty well doomed. That's the sad news. So these are the prospects. Yeah, we're going to see a lot of restrictions from these fish. We've already seen extinctions in 2 rivers since I've lived here, the Teanaway and the Cle Elum. Those populations are gone. The others in the upper basin are down to 100 fish maybe. So how long are they going to last? We don't know. Well, what do you do about that? And this is a tough question, because what do you do? Do you find populations that are really strong and protect those and don't worry about the others? Nobody wants to say just let them go, but that's a tough decision that's going to have to be made. The same with cutthroat here. The difference in cutthroat is they're unlikely to suffer the same fate, but it looks like they may have a problem with non-native species like eastern brook trout moving into their zones. There are some actions that we can do, right? There's no bull trout hatchery, but there's actually talk of bull trout hatcheries, moving bull trout from basin to basin to try to stop these extinctions. There's an interesting idea. You may have heard of marine fish conservation zones around. There's an idea about taking certain sub-basins. Should we make native fish conservation areas just to have kind of a gene bank of native fishes? So something's going to have to be done, and it's going to be some difficult decisions. Let's move farther downstream to where we find salmon. Okay, so here's the good news. And there are definitely people in this room that should look at this graph and go, yep, I was a part of that. Because there were a lot of efforts. You know, if you lived here in the early 90s, I guess it could be easy to look at this and say, well, shoot, I guess salmon are about to go extinct here. But a lot of efforts. They are back. Coho is back. This is an amazing story that sockeye are now back. But what's going to happen from 2015, 16, 17, 18 to 2040 and 2080? That's the issue. So I'm going to go back to this graph that Clay showed, the American River. And what I did was I took this graph and I have simplified it by just taking monthly means over about the past 50 years. And I'd like to ask questions like, well, what's going to happen with salmon? This is the American River. We have spring Chinook salmon up there. We know that eggs develop strictly by temperature. It has nothing to do with the flow. Once they reach a certain number of degree days, they hatch. The little salmon then stay in the streams. They might find side channels to get out of the main flow. Low flows will affect where they can go. They will affect where adults can go to come up and spawn. And then this is something that Clay and I have just recently talked about with his results. With potentially higher productivity, are we ever going to see something like an oxygen debt in certain reaches, like you've heard about in the Gulf of Mexico or other places, these dead zones? We've never seen that in streams in the Northwest, but you know, is that possible? We'll see. All right, so I want to take this curve, this hydrograph curve, and turn it here. Now, what happens when snow is now rain? The rain is going to hit the mountains and start running off. So likely, this is what we've got. We have that shift to the winter. And what does that mean for salmon? Well, we know adults typically will come up in May, and they just go up, you know this, they go to the Chinook, will go up to the American River and just find a hole and just sit there all summer long doing nothing, not feeding, just waiting to spawn in August. When they spawn in August, then those eggs are in the gravel, and those eggs will stay until they get enough degree days, then they hatch out. Typically, actually they're probably hatching or hatched right now. But those little baby salmon will stay in the gravel and just wiggle around. Finally, they'll come out maybe, you know, sometime in, where are we? Sometime in March or April. They'll find something to eat. They have about 48 hours to get that first bit of food or they won't survive. What are the conditions going to be like with this new hydrograph at peak flows right when they emerge? Yeah, that's an issue. But really the big problem and concern, I think, is what are we going to do when the flows get to base flow by early July, which is what the projections are. So if we're down here, low flow, much, much higher temperatures, this is probably a severe bottleneck, and this is what we saw in 2015. If it's even more severe in coming years, there's the question. What are we supposed to do about that? This is another one of these models, and some of the stuff that Clay showed, I want to just draw your attention. Climate Change Journal, issue 102, the entire issue was based on projections for Washington State. So interesting to look at those papers. This one shows changes in the snowpack, but this one shows changes in the currents of floods. Now look where we are in the Yakima. Projections are we're going to have a lot more flooding. Remember what happened on campus last year? That's tiny. I mean, that's minor. That's a little inconvenience. That's not an inconvenience. That could easily, that was a tiny stream with a culvert that just blew out really, really quickly. This was the Yakima River down at Ringer Road a few years ago. You may have seen that. This happened last year. This is Natchez River. This is 40th Avenue. There's Fred Meyer in Yakima. This is going to happen. Question is, do we just kind of watch it and then go, oh, wow, that's tough. Let's rebuild the bridge. I mean, we're not going to prevent this, but how do we live with this? Okay, that's going to happen. What happens when all that water's gone? Then it gets hot and dry. If we run out of water, this is what Shasta in California looked like a few years ago. That's a lot of water not able to be used for irrigation. We don't want to see apple orchards looking like this. You a wine drinker? You don't want to see that. Hops? Oh my God. We cannot have that happen, right? If you're a hay grower, you may not be as worried. Why? Well, you get water early in the season, you get a good first cutting, you might survive. But these crops need water later in the year. This is going to be tough. Well, unlike our current president that doesn't think this is going to happen, there are people in this valley that think something like this is going to happen. And there's a group that has already started a plan years ago to think about water conservation. And you've probably heard of the Yakima Basin Integrated Water Resource Management Plan, or just the Yakima Basin Irrigated Plan. And I know there's a lot on this slide, but I just want to show you that there are sort of 7 different strategies to try to conserve water. And Hope, can you help me? There's a little, like a 1-minute video.
So what is the Yakima Basin Integrated Plan? It's the 3rd phase of the Yakima River Basin Water Enhancement Project, or YARBWEP. After devastating drought in the 1970s, Congress authorized the YARBWEP feasibility study to find solutions to the basin's water supply problems. In 1984, Congress authorized YARBWEP Phase 1 to build fish screens and ladders at diversion dams. YARBWEP Phase 2 was authorized in 1994 to conserve water for agriculture and in-stream flows. YARBWEP Phase 3 is known as the Yakima Basin Integrated Plan, which itself has 3 phases that will span 30 years. We are currently in the initial development phase. This is a watershed-scale, balanced approach to sustainable water supply for fish, families, farms, and forests in a basin with shifting hydrologic conditions. The Yakima Basin Integrated Plan has 7 key elements that represent unique stakeholder interests, all of which are moving forward together for the overall health of the basin.
So this is the one that I think is interesting, right? We're going to increase storage. So is that the problem? If we could just store all that water that's running off, we'll just use it when we need it. So let's just make the reservoirs huge. So that's part of it, water storage. Yeah, we're going to change canals, provide fish passage. Let's, you have any idea what that means?
Paying people to conserve their water.
Yeah, or just buy it. I'll buy your water and I'll grow fish with it. I'll just keep it in the river, right? What about this? How do you store groundwater? Is it possible to take surface water and store it in the ground? Do we know everything about our aquifers? Yeah, this is kind of an interesting, big unknown. But I think this whole plan is great, and it's got ideas to conserve water for fish, for agriculture. But this plan really says nothing about how do we plan for floods and increase runoff. What do we do with all this flood water? I don't know. Is there a way that we could sort of store it as groundwater in certain areas? I don't know. That's going to be interesting, but at least there's a plan for what to do. All right, can I just escape out of that? And there's just one more slide I wanted to show, and then it's question time. Questions for you from Clay and I. So what's the future? Anybody remember this guy? So I think he summed it up. Yeah, it's an unknowable unknown. Look, it's going to get hotter, right? And there's going to be more rain in the winter. And it's going to be a lot drier in the summer. We have a plan, or people are working on a plan for the next 20 or 30 years. But I think, Clay, let's stop there and just see if there's any ideas that you guys have about, because this is our home. I mean, water is the lifeblood of this whole region. What do you think?